Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we've got this lovely Carrera road bike in. It actually reached its last pedal stroke. It was a winter bike, it wasn't changing gear, the brakes were ropey, the chain had completely worn out, the headset bearings had gone, it needed a new cassette, some internal routing, and really was in a very sorry state. You can see here immediately we've got a broken rear derailleur cable, so this was the main reason why this bike was here along with the service. It shifted its last shift. Very common problem on these particular generation of Shimano shifters where the cable breaks, but we'll show you that as we go. You can see here the tail was loose in the frame, so clearly we've got an issue going on here with the gear shifting. And the chain itself, not only was it stretched, which I'll show you momentarily, but it was actually also too long. You can see here how the derailleur is running against the chain. It could do with a few less links in it than what is in it. It's actually the wrong size. Quite a common problem in that people often take a chain out of a packet, put it straight on a bike, but don't actually size it to the length of their chainstay. You can see here it's stretched completely off. It needs replacing. The problem with this, when you get to this level of stretch, is you wear the cassette as well. You really do need a chain checker in your arsenal. It to me is as important as a pump itself to pump up the tyres, to check your chain regularly, because if you get it to this point you're going to need to replace other components. You can save yourself an awful lot of money just by checking your chain length. So for us, the first stage with this service is to strip the bike down, to really weigh up what we need to be replacing, the condition of the components, and have a feel for the bike as we're doing this as well, to see what extra work we need to do. So off comes this cassette. This is actually worn out along with the chain. The cogs themselves, the space in between the top of the teeth is elongated, so if we put a new chain on that it would just skip over the top of that. So we also need to replace that cassette during this service. Taking off the rear derailleur itself, we'll take off both derailleurs and also the cabling. I want to be careful not to pull that right out of the frame because that will help us guide the new one through. And you can see here the derailleur itself isn't too badly worn, needs cleaning up, it needs lubricating, and it needs this post-winter service to really bring this back to condition. Now I couldn't actually get the front derailleur off without removing the bottle cage. Does no harm to remove that because I can lubricate the bolt holes themselves when I put it back together, which you'll see during the video. Off comes that front derailleur. That's quite good, and you can see there it's not too greasy, it's nice and wet, it has been oiled and lubricated. It's okay, it just needs a good service, so it needs cleaning down and lubricating. I'm going to remove the pedals on this one because we actually want to take the chain set apart, which I'll show you on the bench. So off come the pedals. Thankfully they weren't too tight in there, they were actually torqued around about right, so they came out nice and easily. And now we can remove the chain set. This is actually a triple chain set on the front. You don't see that very often on a road bike. It's more considered to be a mountain bike chain set, but in this instance it had a triple on the front of this one, so we need to remove the pedal arm and remove that triple chain set to clean that up and sort that out. Had to just help that out a little bit with a little tap of a mallet to get that through the bearing. Once that's out, you can see it's quite grimy, certainly needs cleaning, certainly needs looking at. And also, once this is out, I can feel the bottom bracket bearings to feel the wear in those and to check that they're okay, and in this instance they were. Removing the brake pads before I removed the calipers, because all 4 brake pads on this bike were worn out, they've worn down to their limits, so we do need to replace the brake pads. And also this rear brake was a little bit sticky. I actually diagnosed that down to the cable, so we're going to actually replace the cable as well. It was binding in the outer of the cable, so we're going to actually replace that cable along with the rear derailleur cable. We'll also take off the front brake. You can see the adjusters wound right up out of that one there. That's probably because the brake pads have worn and the rider has adjusted that steadily, but we want to reset everything, so we'll have new brake pads in there, reset that adjuster, clean everything up and lubricate it before it goes back on the bike. It was quite stiff to get out of that one. There was quite a bit of debris in the mount hole there on the forks, and you can see here on both of the calipers there was an awful lot of this white powdery corrosion on the caliper threads themselves, so we're going to clean that off during the cleaning process, and then we'll also lubricate the bolts that go on those to make sure that we can avoid this happening in the future riding the bike. I'm going to use some cable guides here to remove the old cable, so I'll put a cable guide into the chainstay and then a cable guide in the main tube of the bike here, so we just work that out through the top. That will enable us to get a new cable in with a little bit less work. There were some fittings on the end of those which we also had to undo and remove. But you can see here, this was the original inner from that outer, where it snapped right as it came out of that outer into the shifter. You can see how that's frayed off, quite nasty really, but they gradually fray. You'll start to get some shifting problems, is a telltale sign, before eventually they break off and you end up with this little tail stuck in the shifter. These can be a nightmare to remove at times, but thankfully for us on this occasion it came out quite easily, so I was quite relieved about that, because it can involve quite a lot of work to get these out at times. You can see there how that's frayed off right at the end of the cable. With all the shift in it, rotates around a camber, and it does tend to cause that problem with age on the cables. Out also comes the brake cables. This was actually wired up European, so the rear brake cable was on the right hand shifter, which usually in the UK is the other way around, but it makes no difference really. And now I'm going to also break down this chain set so I can really work my cleaning into the chain set, get all those cogs off and get those all cleaned up before we put it back together, and that will also enable us to lubricate them and make sure that they are serviceable in the future. So that came apart quite nicely. Quite pleased with those. The teeth on those looked okay to me, they didn't jump, so that was good. You can see here how around the teeth we've got all this debris build up on this one. Now the issue you have with this is that you'll see when I pull this together how much is there. This wasn't oily, it was much more like grit, and that is literally like having a sheet of sandpaper on your chain set. That's going to not only wear the teeth of the chain set, it's also going to wear your chain. So we want to clean that off as part of this service to make sure that moving forwards we're not going to have any issues with just the debris and grit that's on the cogs themselves. So we clean all that up. Also, we're going to strip down the derailleur. We tend to do this every time. We can clean up the jockey wheels and lubricate those, clean up the housing of the derailleur itself to make sure everything there is spot on. And then we pick a few of the components out that we really want a deep clean, and we'll put these into our ultrasonic cleaner and wash those through. And that really gets in deep where you can't always get with brushes and rags and your cleaning arsenal by itself. So we make sure that we clean everything up through there, and then we wash it all down. I'll dry all these components off with a microfiber towel, sometimes blow them through with an airline to really get them dry, and they really come up absolutely beautifully once they've been cleaned with our process of washing them down with these detailing brushes, ultrasonic cleaning them and just drying them off and getting them really nice. All these components came out really nicely. They're the lovely shiny aluminium components. You don't see these so much anymore. Everything tends to be blacks and greys these days, but I quite like a shiny silver component. I think they always come up very nice. You can see there we're using our detailing brush to clean the chain set off itself. Now what I'm doing here is I'm going to lubricate these spiders with a little bit of our general purpose grease. This will actually help me next time I come to service this bike, because sometimes these components will bind together, but along with that and then our anti-seize grease here on the threads of the bolts that hold everything together enables me to actually separate these components again. Next time I service the bike, it will just be much easier. I'll have less corrosion issues, and it just really helps. So that's what we're doing here. We're now putting this back together. You can see how clean that's come up, how nice it is, looking really nice. That will now do many more miles. Obviously the presentation of the bike is very important. So rebuilding this was a bit of a fiddle. The big chain ring had nuts and bolts, and there were also a row of spacers for the small ring. Then the small ring had bolts that threaded into the pedal arm to hold that on. And then what I'll do with that is run my torque wrench around all the bolts here to make sure they're absolutely all spot on and tight. Obviously there's two rows with these because this is the triple, so we've done the back row and then the front row, and that's now ready to refit on the bike. With the rear derailleur, I'm going to use our premium grease here on the jockey wheels. It just helps lubricate those bushes, helps everything run smoothly. It's not bad practice to make sure that you re-grease these quite regularly. It will prolong the life of those without the wear that you often get in the middle. And then I'm using a little bit of the Park Tool thread locker on the mounts for the jockey wheels to stop those coming undone at any point during the riding. And goes the tension pulley and then the guide pulley, and we tighten those up nicely. Not too much wear in either of these jockey wheels, which is good, so there's no issues refitting them. And then we will also lubricate the thumb adjuster. It's very common for these to bind in a derailleur. Again, this is all preventative measures that not only help with your adjustments moving down the line with the bike, but also help me next time I service the bike to be able to actually take it apart before I re-clean everything and re-lubricate. It's just a good practice to also lubricate those thumb adjusters. I'm also going to lubricate the body itself, so we're using our premium grease there on the spring, and then we are using general purpose oil to lubricate the pivot points of the derailleur. You can feel them free up and spring much smoother even on the bench, which is why I lubricate them. Same principle on the front derailleur, a little bit of our premium grease on the spring, the return spring, and then a little bit of general purpose oil on the pivot points again, that all help this component move up and down without seizing. This was actually a little bit stiff when it came in, but once we'd finished, the shifting on the front end was very, very nice. And I'm also going to lubricate the skewer that runs through the axles of the wheels. So I've used general purpose oil on the lever, general purpose grease on the axle itself, and then a little bit of anti-seize grease on the threads that the actual end screws onto. And I find this is a good way of doing it. It enables it to slide through the axle itself and do up very, very nicely and actuate constantly. On go the new brake pads now onto one of the brakes here. We're fitting new pads because the old ones were very, very worn. And then I will also lubricate, again, another thumb adjuster that's often forgotten, the thumb adjuster for the brake itself. So I'm actually using general purpose oil here because it is an aluminium adjuster into an aluminium body. And then I will also just give a little oil to the quick release and also the pivots of the brake. They do get very, very stiff on these. And often forgotten is the slider here for the spring. With this, I'm using silicone grease that will work into the slider and enable that spring to slide in and out of that slider and actuate nicely. It just gives a little smoother actuation to the brake caliper. But the other issue we had with this bike was the steering was very, very gravelly, very notchy. The headset bearings are completely worn out on this bike. It was a timely service just to get these done, let alone the other issues that we found with the bike. These were one of the sets of bearings in the bike that had it, really needed to be replaced with this service. So off come the forks, and you can see here the bearings coming out of the fork there. You can see how brown and grimy they are. Same with this bottom one. They were well wedged in, but they did come out, they slid out, and you can see the body of that, how brown and corroded that is. At the 12 o'clock position on that left hand one, the brownness of the oil that protects that, that's actually rust seeping out from the bearings within the actual housing of the bearing itself. So we're going to clean down the forks, make sure the steerer tube and everything is all clean and okay. So we squirt that down with some degreaser, wipe that down, and that will enable us to put our new bearings onto a nice clean surface without any gravelly noises or grittiness in there. Same with the cups as well. We need to clean out all this grease that's in here. A little bit over greased really, this one. Needed slightly less grease than what's in there. This is what we're now going to do. We're going to use our premium grease here. It just helps house the bearings without any noises, and also just protects the two layers of the carbon steerer fork against the stainless steel bearing from corrosion. Same with the cups. These are actually aluminium cups that are bonded into this frame. So we'll just put a little bit of our premium grease on there, again to stop any corrosion against the stainless steel outer race of the bearing. And on go the forks. Lovely bearings that we put in these ones, and then obviously all the spacers and the various components to put the stem on. Then once that's on, we are looking very, very good with the steering. It's already way smoother. The handlebars were much freer. Even at this stage, before I'd even tightened everything up, they felt so much nicer. The thing with the bearings is that when they get stiff and they get gravelly, the bike actually becomes a little bit unstable. So it's a good practice to make sure your bearings are okay on your headset. Next up, we're going to wash the frame down. Now this is a winter bike. We're just heading in towards spring in the UK, and you do get an awful lot of corrosion, and the roads are salted and wet, so all that salt and water ends up on these frames. It can be a catalyst really for corrosion, so we want to be washing the bike down mainly to get that salt layer and water layer off of the bike, because if there's a fine film of salt on these bikes and then you ride them in the next rainstorm, that catalyst and the corrosion, the galvanic corrosion you can get between stainless steel and aluminium components, which is very common on bikes, really needs to be cleaned off. And that's another reason why we do the process of all the lubricating that we do, is to stop corrosion and allowing that catalyst of water between layers. The oils and greases protect against that, so that's why we do that. All these components that we use on our videos you can buy on our website. We sell all the greases, all the cables, an awful lot of the tools, detailing, brushes, etc. that we use, and it's a great way to help support the channel. So please do check out the link in the description and have a look at the website. Thank you to everyone who's placed an order. We appreciate every single one, and it allows us to carry on making these videos, so thank you very much. I'm now going to be putting on a new cassette. You can see there I've used our general purpose grease on the hub. That will again help it just slide on and off, and on goes the lock ring, which we're going to torque up, so we just make sure that's torqued correctly, because obviously you can't do that once the wheel's on. And the other issue we had with this bike was that the rear tyre was actually rotating the wrong way. This is a rotational tyre, so we need to swap that round. So we'll just pop out the inner tube and turn the tyre around. You note here there's no logos on this side, and when I turn it over there is a logo. Often on these more entry-level tyres they have a logo on one side. 9 times out of 10 that logo is always on the drive side, so that you know which way round the tyres rotate. So we lined up the logo with the valve, turned the tyre around, and on the front tyre all I did was actually turn the tyre to make sure that the logo lined up with the valve. The tyre was rotating the correct way, but I just wanted to tidy up the aesthetics of the bike, so I did move that tyre around to get the logo over the valve. Now we're going to start on our cabling. So first of all we're going to put the new brake cable in. The original brake cable is 1.65mm in diameter. The new cable is a 1.5mm super slick cable. These are a lovely tightly wound stainless steel cable that we use on all of our work. And the same here with the derailleur cables. The original derailleur cable is 1.5mm. These ones that we put in are 1.1mm. They have no less strands in them, they're just tighter wound together, so that it makes them a much smoother shift. We do these in kits as well on our website if you want to check those out, but they're a lovely cable and do create a lovely shift on these bikes, especially on a bike of this nature. It can make a huge difference, the cabling, as to how a bike shifts and performs. I'm using a little bit of our premium grease here on the chain set to help that into the bottom bracket. And then obviously we're going to put the various spacers that were already on this and put the pedal arm back on. There is a little safety washer inside there that you want to make sure is closed off, and then we'll also put the bolts back in. And with this I always torque the chain sets before I put anything else together. Although we torque the bike through at the end, chain set is a left to right motion for the change of this derailleur, so we need everything to be in its final set position for our adjustments, which is why I always torque chain sets and derailleurs along the way, so to speak, rather than at the end when I do everything else. So obviously mount bolts and cables all need to be checked and torqued, and then we're going to pop on this rear derailleur. This Tiagra was actually quite a nice little group set, really cleaned up really well with the nice high shine bits on it. And goes that new cable now, then that outer goes into the freshly lubricated thumb adjuster, and then the last detail here is to cut the cable with my guide to keep all the cable lengths even across the bike, and that's now completely set up. I'm going to use a little bit of our anti-seize copper grease there on the threads for the pedals. Again, pedals are very prone to seizing into pedal arms, and pedal arms do need taking off from time to time, as do pedals, so it's always good to put a little bit of grease in there to help those off when you ever have to actually take them off. So they go on, and we will torque those up at the end. Now the mounts for the brakes, these are notorious for binding and corroding, so I always make sure I grease those. We're using our anti-seize grease there on the mount, and that will actually just help us service the bike into the future. And on goes that lovely new outer onto that beautiful cable that we've already fitted, and that will go into the bike, and that actually transformed the braking of this rear brake. The rear brake was a little bit notchy, it was sort of binding shut and then releasing itself gradually. It wasn't a smooth braking process, so we made sure that we solved that with the new cable. Cleaning it up and lubricating it just made the world of difference, really. It was like a new part. On goes the front brake, same principle, where we're using a little bit of our copper grease on the mount, and then on goes the caliper itself. At this stage I always sort of get a sense of satisfaction once we're cabling a bike and we've got all the components on. You know you're really beginning to get there then with the service. Obviously we did shorten this cable a little bit to get that out without having to replace it, so on goes a new cable end there. Again, same principle as with everything. Because we're putting the bottle cage back on, we're lubricating the threads to stop any water or salt getting in there causing the catalyst for corrosion, so we're protecting against that. You can see there the front tyre, I moved the logo over the valve, so the wheels are now going on, brakes are shut off, and then we're putting a brand new chain on this one. And obviously we've shortened this by, actually I think it was 2 links we took out of this in the end to make it the correct length for the bike, so it's a little bit shorter than the original, but that will also mean the position of the derailleur as it's shifting is a little bit more correct where it should be, and the shifting on this was absolutely spot on, so we didn't even actually need to do any adjustment. I literally put this together and I got it just right. You can see there changing up and down all 3 on the front and the rear. And then obviously we've adjusted the brakes, so I just check those through, make sure that they're all centering nicely on the wheel, not pulling the wheel one way or the other. Everything there is working nicely, and now the brakes are working perfectly. So we now need to obviously work through the bike, make sure everything's tight and right. So we're going to start off by torquing up the shifters. They were slightly loose, and then although this wasn't really a detailing service, it was actually a very routine service, it wasn't a full detail, I couldn't stop myself from replacing these bolts. The old ones were very, very rusty. That hood is the spot of a bike that your eyes go to when you're looking at them, so I replaced these with brand new bolts just to tidy that little thing up before I gave the bike back to the customer. So we torque those up, make sure they're absolutely as they need to be. Do these in a crisscross pattern to make sure they're pulled in evenly. And then obviously I can now do the stem. Because the steerer has been off, we want to make sure that's absolutely right. As with most of these components, brakes, etc., we have removed everything, we have replaced the brake pads, we have cleaned everything up, so we need to make sure that everything is absolutely spot on when the bike goes out, which is why we go through everything with a torque wrench. There are set torques for everything. You can research those online if you need to find them. I torque the pedals with a claw fitting as they don't have an Allen fitting in the back of them. The seat post was loose enough to be dangerous. Same with the saddle. These can and do work loose and fall off. It wasn't too loose, but they unwound themselves, so it's good to get that tight again. Same with that rear brake as the front. Pads need to be torqued to stop them moving around under high load. They're often too loose, and that makes the bike feel unstable at high speeds. And then we'll work down to the gearing after doing that brake, so we can now check the rear derailleur, make sure the mount and the pinch bolt is absolutely spot on. And you can see in these before and afters the big difference we've made. The bike now is absolutely working as it should. Brakes are now safe with new pads. We've got all the gearing changing. You can see there we've got the brand new chain, that chain set all cleaned up, everything lubricated nicely, working perfectly. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe to the channel and check out the website. They're the 2 best ways to help us out. We'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.